Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week two, where we will be mapping out historical and current policy and practices. So, in Australian early childhood education and care. So, for many of you who don't have an early years background, this is going to be some important information. It's going to support you in applying theoretical understandings from your readings. So, um, specifically to the Australian context. So I've also included the Queensland context, as this seems to be a focus for many of our local students. For those colleagues who have a background in early years, and I guess like myself, who may have actually been present through some of the reforms, it's going to be a recap. So, the first part of this lecture is going to involve going right back to the historical context and reforms, which is going to involve listening to me. So, it's a bit of a lecture. Then, for those of you who have experience in the field and are here this evening, I want you to share your experiences with the curriculum documents and how they might influence your practice. So, first up, I would like to take this opportunity to first acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands. So, as you are no doubt aware, over the past 2 decades, there has been an increased recognition of the importance of the early years for children, so both at an international and also a national level. Much of this recognition has been drawn from research on early brain development. This recognition of the early years is reflected in our government reforms, policies, and programs that were aimed at supporting children's well-being. Of great significance, these forms have included the codification of curriculum at a national level with the introduction of our belonging, being, and becoming, so the early years framework for Australia. There has also been the introduction of the Australian professional standards for teachers. So this is across early childhood, primary, and secondary. So on the slide, you can see the areas that we're going to be exploring this evening. I will ask you to share any thoughts or perspectives or possibly examples from your teaching context a little bit later on. So, a growing body of research has recognised that early childhood education and care, so birth through to 8 years of age, year 3 in Australia, brings a wide range of benefits, so including those that I have outlined on the slide. So, I'll give you a moment to read through those. Building on Urie Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory as a reference frame, these benefits extend across society, families, and the individual child. Bronfenbrenner believed that an individual's development was affected by everything in their surrounding environment and the interaction and connections within this environment. So, the ecological systems theory holds that we encounter different environments throughout our lifespan and that they influence our behaviour in varying degrees. So, these systems, as you can see on the slide, they include the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, the macrosystem, and the chronosystem, or the dimension of time. So, this demonstrates the influence of both change and constancy in an individual child's environment. So, the availability of supportive and cohesive settings, such as kindergarten and childcare, are vital for children and their families. So, they involve a complex web of interactions, So across the 5 systems on the slide, which have social, cultural, political, and also, I guess importantly, ethical dimensions, all that we need to consider in our practice. So drawing on this research and comparing early childhood education and care across 20 countries, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, has been instrumental in shaping early childhood policy and also provision of quality care. A growing number of countries are now establishing monitoring systems to ensure quality and also accountability in early childhood education and care programs. So in Australia, as many of you would know, we're monitored by an independent organisation called ASIQA, so the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority. It's a bit of a mouthful. So CEQA also published the Guide to the National Quality Framework and assess and approve our individual and also our organisational qualifications. So they're a really important organisation for Australian early childhood. So going back to 2006, the first of many international Starting Strong reports made a series of recommendations. So these were to improve the early childhood system and services internationally. Many of these have been taken up in Australia. So some of the key recommendations in the reports included enhanced quality standards, continuous quality improvement, development of curriculum guidelines or frameworks, universal access to services. So this meant services should be made available to all children, so regardless of cultural, economic or social status. There was also an emphasis on children with special needs, Indigenous children, and of course, those living in remote areas. So sitting at the Australian Commonwealth level, we have the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership, so AITSL. So this is where the Australian professional standards are. So they dictate what makes an effective teacher in kindergarten all the way through to secondary. We also have ACARA, of course, so the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. So this, as well as the Australian Primary and Secondary Curriculum, this is also the organisation that NAPLAN, the National Literacy and Numeracy Assessment Program, sits. So we also have ASIQA, as I've mentioned before, who accredit prior to school settings as well as the curriculum in that space, so through the National Quality Standards and the Early Years Learning Framework. So some key early years initiatives in Australia, as I said, included that commitment to universal access. So this was by 2013. This included 15 hours of kindergarten per week, led by a qualified 4-year trained early childhood teacher. The introduction of the National Quality Framework with an emphasis on improved care and provision. The introduction of the Early Years Learning Framework in 2010. Yes, it has been 11 years, hard to believe. This importantly provided us with a foundation of principles, of practices, and learning outcomes. So this was to assist in designing our individual early years curriculums. So there has been a lot of scrutiny, a lot of analysis, and much debate around its development and also its implementation. So you would have been reading about this in your readings, you will be for next week. There was also a plan to increase the number of qualified early childhood practitioners. So this was through the early years workforce strategy. So this included funding and also scholarships as well. So quite a bit of money was put into this. So a workforce action plan was implemented in 2016 with a vision around improving the value, qualifications, and skills of early childhood educators. So there's a link on the slide. I suggest you go to the PowerPoint on Blackboard and have a little look at that at a later point. So now here in 2021, these initiatives are being implemented and overseen by ASIQA. Any questions at this point, or we're going along nicely? As I said, the first part of this week is going to be a bit of a lecture, mainly just to get you up to speed with all of these key initiatives. So some further initiatives, the Narragansett Initiative, overseen by the independent body Reconciliation Australia. So this supports schools and early learning services to develop environments that foster knowledge and pride in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories. It also focuses on cultures and the contributions from Indigenous Australians. The 2014 Ella program, this was aimed at making language learning more engaging. If you can believe, the government invested $27 million in this particular program. And of course, age-appropriate pedagogies. So initiative that documents, it includes documents outlining all sorts of important age-appropriate pedagogies. So it was introduced in 2016, identifying the need for a more holistic approach in the early years of schooling. So this was actually after the transition of preschool to prep as the first year of primary school. So there was a lot of research after this, and it indicated that prep learning environments were moving away from early years pedagogies to more whole classroom teaching, with a focus on direct instruction. So if you haven't accessed these documents, I recommend that you do so, age-appropriate pedagogies. So it's available in the unit readings under curriculum frameworks. I will be going through these in more detail in later weeks because they are important documents that I think will be very relevant to many of your assessment tasks. So we will break these down further. So the underlying principle with all early childhood education and care programs, whether standalone kindergarten or long day childcare, is quality. So quality, this includes adult and child verbal interactions, staff knowledge and understanding the curriculum or how the curriculum is applied, knowledge of how children learn, adult skills in supporting children to resolve conflict, helping parents to support children at home. This was a big focus. So there are many layers within these 5 areas that we're going to explore later in the unit. Okay. So on the slide, you can see some of the specific initiatives for our Queensland context. So I'm going to give you a moment to read the slide. Again, I have provided links for you to look in more detail at these initiatives. And again, the links are available on the PowerPoint on Blackboard. So I'll give you a moment to read through. Any questions at this point? You're welcome to pop the questions into the chat. Okay. All right, so have a look at the link when you get an opportunity. So on the slide are 4 organisations. So these organisations shape the expectations of early childhood teachers. So the Australian College of Teachers, our teacher registration body, Early Childhood Australia, which I'm a member of, and I would advise as advocates of early childhood education and care that you might like to join as well. So it is our Early Childhood Advocacy Association. So it acts in the interests of young children, their families and educators. AITSL, so to promote excellence in education through the Australian Professional Standards, and again, ASIQA, as I've mentioned before. So looking specifically at kindergarten, our Australian Historical Foundations began way back in 1907 with the Creche and Kindergarten Association. So it was initially established originally for underprivileged children, so children from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Someone did ask that earlier.
Okay, is there a question there? Did we start early this week? Yeah, we did start a bit early. I'm sorry about that. You can go back and have a look at the recording. Tiffany and I were wondering why no one was here, but we did start early. So I apologize for that. Maybe we're going on time from a different state. I don't know. But so basically we're just going through some of the initiatives within Australia and also within the within Queensland as well. So for those of you that are here on time, but we have started earlier, the you're going to be able to access the recording as well. And because this is a bit of a lecture this week at the beginning, it probably would be good to go back and to access the recording as well. The notice did say 6:30 p.m. Queensland time. Sharon, you are correct, but it was my mistake. I don't know why. I was keen to start. I was keen to get on and join you. So it was my error and I do apologize for that. Okay. So where were we? We're looking at the historical foundation. So as you can see on the slide, early approaches to kindergarten were very formal. So really formal looking at those. So the Lady Gowrie Centres were established in 1940 by the Australian Commonwealth Government. The Brisbane Centre opened in June 1940 with 7 2-year-old children and 10 4-year-old children. So by November of that year, there were 57 children enrolled. So as well as teachers, a registered nurse and a social worker, the centre also employed a secretary and a cook housekeeper. I think that's really cool. I've gone back and had a look at some of these photos. I've got a bit of a collection. I'm a bit of a historian for Brisbane history. I really like looking into, especially early childhood. I like looking into some of these old photos. So hot meals and a dessert were provided for children each day. And they soon established a college to train teachers. And as many of you Brisbane people will know, this centre is still operational today. So that's very exciting. Any questions? for those of you that have just joined us, we did start early. Tiffany and I were here, weren't we, Tiffany? I got the times mixed up. And
Sorry
so
about that, Angela.
don't worry. I was the same. I think I just came on earlier, and then when I saw you, I thought, oh, we better get started. So that is not a problem. But as I said, we have got a recording. So you can watch that first part, which is very teacher talky. You can watch that first part in the recording. All right, so moving on. The first universal preschool, so in the year before formal schooling, was introduced in Australia in 1972. So we're going right back. So for those of you that don't have a lot of experience in early childhood, possibly who are secondary trained, or if you are an overseas student, this is going to give you a really good, solid foundation to base your understanding and insights on. So in 1996, we saw the introduction of the preschool curriculum guidelines in Queensland. So preschool at this point, in Queensland at least, it wasn't formal, and it actually had very low participation rates. In 2003, we saw the beginning of the Queensland Prep trials. So in an attempt to bring Queensland preschool in line with other states, and also in an attempt to increase participation. So the preschool system as it existed in Queensland was gradually phased out with the introduction of full-time prep in the year before formal schooling. So this was formalised in 2007 using the early years curriculum guidelines, and it was made compulsory in 2017 through the No Child is Left Behind initiative. Do we remember way back then? The No Child is Left Behind initiative. So a universal kindergarten year was also introduced in 2007. So I've got a bit of a timeline there just to lay it out so you can see it. It wasn't until 2010 that the Queensland Kindergarten Learning Guideline was introduced. So this is the formal curriculum guide used in many kindergartens in Queensland. So while the early years learning framework, the national curriculum focuses on children from birth to 5 years, the Queensland Kindergarten Learning Guideline, it aims to specifically enrich children's learning in the kindergarten year. So if you're local, if you're in Queensland and you're focusing on kindergarten in your assessment task, then I think this curriculum document would be applicable to you. So wasn't that a Bush junior policy in USA? I think it was actually. Yes, Fiona remembers the Queensland preschool curriculum guidelines being introduced. I actually had, when was it? A couple of years ago. My first years were actually the year. They were the students from that year, and God, that made me feel so old. It really did, because to me, it doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was. So yes, the timeline there, it just sort of talks specifically about preschool and kindergarten in Queensland, so that local focus here for now. So approved kindergarten programs are in a number of different settings in Queensland. So these, of course, will vary across Australian states and territories. I'll give you a moment to read the slide. Can anyone think of any other? So, of course, those independent centres are going to include Montessori and Steiner and Reggio-focused kindergartens. And a lot of the community-based kindergartens, which I've worked for quite a few of them in the past, those independent centres are starting to be amalgamated with some of the Good Start Learning, Cath Ed as well. They seem to be taking on a lot of those community-based kindergartens that are finding it quite difficult to continue on due to a lack of funds. So there's a kindy program at Distance Education in Queensland for remote students. Oh, yeah, that's good. I'm going to add that. Thank you, Kamiko. I shall add distance education too. Thank you for telling me that. Excellent. All right, so moving on, the Australian National Framework, it outlines the guidelines and also the regulations prescribed by the Australian government, so for childcare education providers. So while the National Quality Standards and the Early Years Learning Framework are key aspects of the National Quality Framework, so the NQF outlines the 7 national quality standards which set the national benchmark for early childhood education and care, and also outside school hours care services in Australia. So it's the national body. So it includes educational program and practice, including documentation, children's health and safety, physical environments, staffing arrangements, relationships with children, collaborative partnerships with families and communities, and leadership and service management. So early years education and care settings are assessed and rated by the state regulatory authority against the 7 national quality standards, and they're given a rating for each of the 7 quality areas and an overall rating based on these results. So regulatory authorities, they make unscheduled and scheduled visits to services in addition to assessment and rating visits. So these include monitoring, spot check and compliance visits to ensure the service is operating within those national legislation. Again, I provided a link on the slide to a fact sheet for further details about the rating process, but I'm sure those of you who work in prior to school settings are well aware of that. Fiona has, yes, well, Fiona and I have spoken about this. It includes many days of great stress. So yeah, but it's very important that there is a monitoring system, of course, and for those services that do achieve an exceeding rating, it's it's a really it really shows the dedication that they have to the early childhood education and care, so to quality care. So fundamental to the National Quality Framework under Quality Area 1 is the Early Years Learning Framework. So this is our curriculum framework, and it's a view of children's lives characterized by that belonging, being and becoming. And we're going to explore what that is in later weeks. So from birth, children, they're connected to family, community, culture and place. Their earliest development and learning takes place through these relationships. So particularly within families who, of course, are children's first and most influential educators. So as young children participate in everyday life, they're going to develop interests and construct their own identities and understandings of the world. So this is the basis of the belonging, being and becoming, which of course you will be reading about in your readings. Any questions or comments in the chat? Oh, Eunice is saying that the centre is due for a rating soon. Good luck with that, Eunice. Can be a stressful time. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading through the chat. So I've given you a rundown on some of the reforms that have led to the development of our curriculum documents, and we're now going to look at what they involve. In Queensland, as well as the early years learning framework for birth to year 3, some kindergarten settings, as I mentioned before, utilise the Queensland curriculum guidelines. So if you look at a comparison of the learning and developmental areas for each curriculum guide or framework, you'll see a slight difference between the learning areas for the QKLG and the outcomes for the ELF. But as you can see, they are very, very similar documents. So it's important to remember that no matter what document you're referring to, these are frameworks. They're curriculum frameworks rather than a script for early childhood practice. They're guidelines. So for those familiar with the document, you'll note that the early years learning framework reflects a holistic approach to learning and development. So looking at the whole child. So this is embedded within our play-based learning environments, and it also reflects the contemporary theories and research evidence that we mentioned earlier. So for those of you who have experienced early childhood settings, and I know there are a lot of you, I want you to think about how these principles, so whether you're looking at the QKLG or the EYLF, how these curriculum principles have shaped your practice. Any thoughts about that? Again, you can speak now, or you're welcome to type in the chat. So I know we've got some of you here this evening who are experienced in the prior to school settings. How have you used these curriculum documents? I might ask you to pop your cameras on too. This point. Eunice, you said that you're going to be being rated soon, so you would be very familiar with the curriculum documents. You might have to unmute your microphone, Eunice.
It's on mute now.
Yeah.
We do get assessed. We don't know the date yet, but I've been through one assessment and rating. It's nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're being assessed for.
Yeah.
The assessors will come in a classroom and observe you teaching, have a chat with the children,
Yeah.
and you get the report days after of and they'll note the conversations you've had and put it in all the different quality areas there.
Yeah.
And so for the second one, we don't know when we're getting assessed, but
yeah. So we've got, thank you, Eunice. Thank you. We've got some, Tiffany saying they drive practice. They make me more mindful of the whole child. Fiona, yeah. Sharon, it's all brand new to you. Okay, so fair enough, that's fine. No problem, Sam. Sarah, not a problem at all that you can't turn your camera on. So brand new to you as well. So I think the important thing to remember is that the outcomes, it's about having a clear focus on children's learning and well-being and having a shared language for curriculum in the early childhood field. It's a base for planning, promoting and assessing learning in the early years space, including families and communities in children's learning, and also developing strong relationships to do so. So I guess it's also about knowing how to use specific strategies. It's about knowing your students really well. So focusing on differentiating, having clear communication, so being active listeners with children and parents. So I guess another area as well, in all of these: identity, connected and contribute, well-being, confident, involved learners, effective communicators, is the need to have a good understanding of child development. That's essential. Underlying all of that is extremely good observation skills, so that you can develop an understanding of learners. I'm just reading the chat. So Pamela's mainly used the Australian curriculum, but her studies have certainly featured the QKLG and the ELF. Very useful guidelines to form the foundation when planning. Yeah. And so you're right, they are guidelines. I guess in some ways it's something to aspire to as well. So approaches to curriculum, they reflect really significant ideas. So looking at the slide, ideas about individuals setting stakeholders, so the children, the families, educators, and also the community. So it's important, I guess, in some way we can link this back to Urie Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory as well, can't we? So it's important to remember that in early childhood education and care, our carefully selected approaches to curriculum can support, and they also reflect the setting specific context, their ideas, and also their philosophy as well. So some approaches, they may be along the lines of a social pedagogic approach, so more in line with a Vygotskian perspective. So with a focus on cooperative dialogues between children, families, and educators. So we would be thinking about cohesive communities of practice here, everyone working together and sharing ideas. So based on the context. We could also call it a futures orientated approach. So looking to encourage learning processes and knowledge that are going to assist children as 21st century learners. So it's always changing. So we really have to think about those skills, the ICT skills, the entrepreneurial skills that our learners are really going to need moving into the future. So at the other end of the spectrum, or the continuum, is a more instrumentalist approach. So we're looking more, I guess, in terms of a Piagetian perspective. So this one is, I guess, and it's right down the end of the continuum, is focused more on school readiness. So this is where the focus will be on learners acquiring specific skills and subject content. So this is to prepare them for entering primary school. So we find that this is the focus that parents prefer. And as early childhood teachers, we need to educate them that that more futures orientated approach, that social pedagogic approach, is really important. So Warren has said there is a lot of assumptions in what the educator is capable of with limited resources and time. Yep. Did you want to clarify what you mean there, Warren?
Sure, Angela. So, excuse me. I've been reading through a lot of papers and stuff. Very good. I mean, there's lots of good points and things, but it's assuming that they have proper professional development, like you just mentioned now, ICT and all of that. Without quality professional development as well as time, educators don't have a chance to actually learn this unless they do it outside of in their private time, which a lot don't. They don't have the motivation to do that. So a lot of these papers and articles are assuming that they have these resources available, but then you have financial pressures and business pressures that basically limit them in that regard.
I guess also if we're talking about prior to school context, so private early childhood centres and facilities, that is a big consideration. And, you know, in some cases, ECT teachers are paying for their own professional development. And I know as an ECT teacher, early childhood teacher, I had to pay for my own professional development. That wasn't part of our budget. And I guess if you're lucky enough to be in a centre that is, you know, cohesive and, you know, that emphasises and advocates for, you know, this culture of inquiry, then you're lucky. But I think.
But yeah, so.
Go on.
Sorry, I was about to say, is like you said, there's a few out there that might put money towards their budget, but there has been studies before that many companies, non-profit and for-profit and private, basically put aside less than 5% of their budget towards professional development, which is, to me, you're kind of undermining your largest asset being your teacher. So
I agree completely. Yeah, I agree completely. I think now, though, especially in kindergarten, in more state, if we're talking about early primary and kindergarten areas, in that area of early childhood, more emphasis is being put on professional development. And very different now. Back in my day in early primary, the focus was, okay, this is what we're going to do our professional development on. Everyone goes to the same professional development. And it's often to do with some change in curriculum or a different direction that the school is going in. Now, professional development is much more focused on teachers' individual goals. And so you can decide on what you actually want to go and do your professional development on. So there's more of an emphasis on it now.
I did read through the mounds of paperwork somewhere that there was that type of focus, like now teachers want to learn what they want to learn. So if you push them into a topic that they're not interested in, you're not going to get your quality out of it or investment out of it. Yeah. So that was my elaborate assumptions of teachers and what they learn.
Oh, definitely. So I also think that, you know, for this particular assessment task that you have to do, so part one, well, there are two assessment tasks, but the first one is really looking at what is important to you. But the second one is looking at how you can put it into practice, and it is around professional development. So, you know, with that emphasis on inquiry-based communities of practice. So Warren, this is, you know, I agree with you, and this is part of, I guess, in higher education, that we are having this focus on professional development and advocating for these kind of systems. And for people like you, everyone here tonight in this course, who are here to develop their understandings in early childhood education, to take, you know, to really think about these practices and implement them in your settings, you know, and with that focus on professional development.
Well, yeah, and like I cross over the 604, as I mentioned last week, and there just seems to be a gap in there's actually no financial, how can I say, investment literature. I don't know how to word it correctly at this time, but there's, like, if you put in professional development now, what will you get back in 2 or 3 years' time? And there just doesn't seem to be that much literature in that particular area.
Yeah, yeah. A gap in the literature, I hear. I think that might be a PhD, possibly, Warren, or
Far from it.
further research,
Well, if there's a gap in the literature, though, I'm just going to say, well, there's a gap, and that someone else can chase that up.
Okay, you're not the man for the job.
Not at the time, not at this time. If I get grinding and quit my job, and fine, yeah, okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
No worries.
The VEYLDF, what's that, Tiffany? It talks about coaching teachers.
So that's the Victorian frameworks,
Oh,
so the
okay.
Victorian Early Years and Learning and Development Framework. And so there's been a fairly big investment in Victoria in the early years. We're working towards funded 3-year-old kinder next year, but they talk a lot about, we're in this space at the moment, we're talking a lot about training and how sometimes training is not effective, and that coaching might be more the way to go to support teachers' learning and understanding. And again, I guess there's a big investment in terms of school readiness funding. So that's another program that's looking at, developing the capability of teachers. But there is a recognition that just training, simply sort of standing up and talking about something, is not actually hitting the mark, that we need to do more coaching of teachers in practice rather than them going off to professional development.
Yeah, yeah. That's good. I think there
It's a bit of a sideways. Sorry.
No, that's good. And this is in your second assessment task, that when we talk about professional development, that is a very broad term. So coaching could come under professional development. I'm thinking. So if we're looking at a professional development action plan, you can certainly talk about that as well. Now, we've got in China, there is also a guide for children aged 3 to 6, which also reflects the future orientated, but every child is different. We cannot judge a child according to the item in this guideline. It should be more flexible. Excellent. Was that Fanny? Was that you that made that comment?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you want to clarify what you mean there? Are you talking about the early years learning framework specifically, or the approaches?
Yeah. Because in China we also have the guidelines, just like I said, that for the age 3 to 6, and for each items they give the child the skills they have to attend it. For example, at the age 6, they have to play the ball at the they have to jump, they have to run, and they can play the ball at the 6. They can play the ball in the 6 numbers, and I don't think that every child. I think that every child is different, and a lot of the teacher, they just according to this item to teach every child in the same approach or pedagogy. I think that. So I think maybe we can just not regard this guideline as the bubble, just like my teachers in the bachelor degree. He told me we have to remember this guideline, such as the Bible, in everyone's heart, but I think it should be more flexible, especially for the kindergarten child.
Yeah. Well,
yeah. So we should not.
Yeah. That's what I was
we
saying
should not
before,
use the. We should not use the same pedagogy for every children. Yeah. They have the different level for physical and, for example, for the sport skills for them. Every child is different.
Definitely. Yes. Yeah. And the early years learning framework really reflects that, in that I said it's a guideline. So it is very much based on the whole child. So we're looking at, all different areas of development and well-being, but the focus is on a holistic approach, I guess you could say. So where you're looking at the individual child, their interests, their needs, their strengths, and then planning fairly individual programs for each of these children. So we're going to talk a little bit later down the track about emergent curriculum. So I think that might be something, Fanny, that you might be quite interested in terms of that flexibility and more project-based and inquiry-based learning. I agree, Eunice, not one size fits all. Yeah, definitely. So,
yes.
Yeah. Okay, so as you go through the readings and explore the early years theoretical perspectives, you're really going to realize that all of these approaches to curriculum, they're rarely fixed and they're not straightforward. So each context is going to be different. So they're going to be on this continuum in some case, but it will depend on the beliefs, the needs, the desires of families and the community, and also the individual early childhood teachers that work within those contexts as well. I guess in some ways, it is very flexible, and I guess in a lot of these approaches can complement each other as well, and I guess there is a place for all approaches, and that's where age-appropriate pedagogies come in as well, especially in that transition to school. So using a range of different pedagogical strategies to support children. Okay, so the phrase early childhood education and care, it is a broad term. So it encompasses all contexts and programs specific to children aged birth to 8 years of age. So as most of you will be aware, early childhood education and care programs operate in a number of different settings. So they can include playgroups, centre-based childcare or long day childcare centres, kindergartens, preschool, and the early years of primary school. So the phrase early childhood education and care is used in policy, in curriculum and practice as well. So it's a commonly used term. So the words education and care are combined in the phrase, I guess, to signal that education and care shouldn't exist apart in approaches to young children. So they should be considered together. So it's surprising, though, that this terminology is actually a site of contention, and it's underpinned by a long-standing division between childcare and early education. So, and this is internationally as well. So this education and care division is attributed in part to a combination of historical, cultural, and also political factors as well. And you'll be doing readings around this. So there are also tensions around what age range definition early childhood education and care is or should be. And I find this really interesting because, is it birth to 8 years? Should it be birth to 5 years? Should it be birth to 12 years? If we look at some countries like Sweden, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries, they start education much later than what we do. So there is that emphasis on play-based and imaginative play till much older. So the OECD Starting Strong reports and a lot of research define the ECEC range as birth to 8 years. But if you look at the Teach Queensland website, for example, it says birth to 5 with no mention of prep to year 3 as being early childhood. So, there is contention here, and I'd really like to see what your thoughts are here. What age range would you consider early childhood education and care to be? Any thoughts? Tiffany is
Yeah, hi Angela.
Yeah.
I'm Sarah. I used to teach in childcare settings in toddlers and kindergartens, and I went up to schools and I've taught in prep 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And I definitely think that we need to include kids up to at least 8 in that early years, because they still need majority of them that play-based learning, hands-on inquiry-based, things that we do, like child-centered, child-led. They still need that. There are a couple of kids, and that there always will be, that are ready for sit-down explicit teaching. And there are times where all kids can benefit from it for 10 minutes here and there. But I do think we definitely need to still include those first years of formal schooling as, early years.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely. Anyone else? Would you agree with this? Is there anyone that sort of thinks, no, I think once they start prep or grade 1, it should be more formal, not so much based on play-based learning?
I've got a comment, Angela, if you can hear me properly.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, lovely. Sorry. It's Helen. Hi, everyone. I had issues with my laptop, so I've gone to my iPad and I've never used it before, so I'm hoping it's all coming through clear. I'm a primary trained teacher. I sort of am of the opposite view, that I think when children go into the school environment, it is very different from early childhood care in preschool settings and daycare settings. I was quite involved with my children, used to volunteer at the preschool and so forth. And for myself, I actually thought it lacked at that time, and that's when the early years framework was sort of coming into play. And I thought it lacked that encouraging children to be able to adapt and transition properly into school. And I had been a kindergarten teacher for some time, and the children that didn't come from a formal preschool setting really struggled adjusting to routine and following instruction.
Yeah.
They came from sort of a free play type of setting, and they can eat when they want and drink when they want. It was very hard to get them into a structured routine where they had to sit down and do tasks. And of course, in the primary setting, there's a lot of accountability there. You're working against the curriculum and meeting all the strands of each KLA. So I disagree to an extent.
Oh, no. And please disagree. I think, as Pamela has said here, it's transition is a process. So I think if we look at age-appropriate pedagogies, and I keep directing you to this because early years learning framework, as Warren has pointed out, it's very much from birth to 5 years. And I guess the issue that we're facing is that big gap between birth to 5 years and that transition into preschool, and that the use of a CARA, that curriculum document. I guess the emphasis needs to be on the pedagogical approaches that teachers are using to support children in those early years. So making sure that there is a bridge, a transition for them to, move to transition from the free play, as you said, and from that more intimate, play with their friends to a more structured environment. So, yeah. Eunice says here in her classroom, she has a structured routine, so a long day childcare centre. She believes in setting the children up to succeed. But I think what we also need to consider is developing those independent skills and encouraging children to think for themselves, because if we're thinking about 21st century learners, this is where we really need to start thinking about critical reflection and being able to learning to be inquiry based. So we really need to think about using a combination of approaches. All right, so when year 3 is asked to NAPLAN test, the class focuses a lot on the testing and less play-based learning. So I don't include year 3. Okay, that's interesting, Kamiko. Yeah. What is
Can
the
I also
transition?
just mention, sorry, I've jumped in again, my
No,
apologies.
please do, go
Yeah,
on.
can I just mention that, you know, putting a K-2 teacher in a conventional school is very different to moving an early childhood educator into a K-2 setting.
Yeah.
They're trained in completely different ways, are aligned with a completely different curriculum. So it's very hard, and there won't be just a kindy teacher. That teacher will move from kindergarten to year 6, obviously. So they're only going to have that minimal training in those early foundation years.
Yeah. At the moment, so early childhood, so I have first years in our stepping in. And so we have early childhood, primary and secondary. So early childhood is they can teach from birth, so in prior to school settings, all the way through to year 3. And primary is prep to the year before high school. So those early childhood teachers have skills, they have understandings, theoretical basis in both before school and also primary as well. So, but, you know, a primary school teacher can't move back and then work in a kindergarten setting. You actually have to be a qualified early childhood teacher to be able to do that. All right, so
okay, yeah.
Having a child in year 3, I already see the anxiety he's experienced in relation to NAPLAN. Yeah, that's a whole nother area. Yeah, I work in a concurrent outdoor, indoor program, Regio inspired service where agency is very important. Excellent, yeah. My whole rationale behind doing early childhood studies is precisely because my training was technically from year 4 to year 9 in South Africa. That's interesting. And I missed, there was some comment here. Fanny's asking, what is the transition in Australia because we don't have this in China? So basically moving from kindergarten into prep. So from a less formal approach to a more formal structured program. Kindergarten isn't compulsory either, Fanny. So it's optional. You don't have to send your child to schooling prior to entering prep. And I know is that different in China? At what year or what age do they have to go into formal schooling?
And I think in China, the kindergarten just is not compulsory for every children. And the compulsory education is age from the age 6, they enter the primary school. So in China, a lot of the parents, they said the first year in primary school is a big disaster for the parents, teachers, and the child, because they can't fit with this new style of the schools and learning and environments. Yeah.
So there is an issue with that transition. Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, so I very agree with these transitions for the children to fit in the new learning style, environment, and the new something they have to learn it. Yeah, different from the kindergarten. Yeah.
Jessica says that daycare educators and teachers at C&K need to work more closely with schools in the catchment area. I agree completely, Jessica. You know, we have these transition statements and things, but a statement isn't enough. It needs to actually be verbal, I believe. I think there needs to be more communication. There are some students that slip through the gaps, and it's also about family daycare as well. There's lots of different, now someone had their hand up. I missed that.
That was me.
Yeah.
100%. I've had 3 children that have gone through C&K, and the time the school gives the C&K kindy teachers is, less than possibly an hour for the entire group that are coming through. And a lot of those children are undiagnosed, have had, ongoing issues, and it's just not invested. And then the teacher in the prep gets these children and he looks at the transition statement and goes, well, this is hardly, you know, this is not really helpful for me and I've got to start all over again. So it's just very frustrating to see just the, you know, just the stress of it all, going through it all, and the parents either not interested or they didn't realise that there are all these different resources out there, and then it comes down to funding with autism and, you know, appointments. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I feel your pain. Yeah, definitely. So some really good points there. And there's quite a bit of discussion in the chat about NAPLAN. And it comes back to the teacher, the anxiety, I guess. Yeah. And I think a lot of the time the anxiety is from the parents as well. There's a lot of parents that are concerned about NAPLAN and the impact that it might have on their children. So again, it's about communication and working with the families. Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I'm just reading.
Sorry, Angela.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry, just going a little bit back a little bit on the transition. Now, I'm not sure how it works in other kindergartens and daycares. I work in a long daycare center. So towards the end of the year, or even sometimes in the middle, we have children transition from one class to the other, just so they are comfortable with the routine. They can spend a few hours of the day or whatever it is. So we have this whole transition program, so to speak. But then, as you mentioned, as other people understand, is that when they go into prep, they haven't had that transition to prep. So it's actually a bit of a shock to them. Yeah. So I'm fortunate enough that my daycare is literally opposite the road from the primary state school. So we have a very, very close relationship. We're almost a feeder system for them. And we will have some of their prep teachers come into our class and just talk to the kids and make sure that everything is fine and whatnot. So just as you said, the transition statement is insufficient, quite honestly. So that's something that we try and work on and try and cultivate.
Yeah, in the kindergarten, it was a community-based kindergarten, and also I brought it in our private kindergarten as well. Our preschool teacher used to do a visit, or kindergarten teacher would do a visit to the prep classroom. So they would be introduced to the teacher and meet the other students, and they would set up buddy systems and all sorts of things. So prior to starting school, and these are the kind of practices that we really need to see. And again, it's about communication within context. So communication with the kindergartens and the long day childcare centres and the prep teachers / the principals and deputy principals of schools. So
sure, but that sits, I mean, my argument now, because there was some resistance, but the argument sits within the outcomes of the ELF, is to build that community link. I kind of think it's number 4, just my memory now. Yeah, so that's part of it. Well, this is a requirement almost, that we have to do something like this.
Oh, definitely. And I think it's up to teachers, early childhood teachers within these spaces, people like yourselves, and I know we've got principals here as well, just to make sure that this does happen, because it is for an individual context. There is no state, requirement or recommendation. It's up to individual services to make this happen, unfortunately. Okay, I think we need to move on. Sorry, Warren, go on.
Would it be beneficial for that type of thing to be a state requirement?
Almost definitely, yeah. And I think, the processes of transition to school have changed. That, we have transition statements now. I guess that's a start. Before it, we had nothing. So this has come in the last few years. So and that has made a difference, but I think it needs to go further. And that involves communication. So the last comment, then we're going to move on. Jade, when I taught prep, the kindergarten attached to our school, we got a lot of enrollments from. They came over to the prep playground, did physical activities, rotations with the preps. It was good for the kindy kids and preppies. Yeah, so, and making those connections, buddying up. A lot of schools actually have transition programs. I know my local state school, the kindergartens in the area go and visit the school in preparation for prep, and they get a buddy from the upper primary that look after them right from the start. They have little bands around, white bands around their hat, and everyone gets in and looks after them and makes them feel really special. So they're the kind of things that we need to start looking. Okay, all right. Let's move on. It's so easy to get caught up on something that is important to us all. And obviously this is, and that's why I'm hearing so many of you wanting to focus on transition to school in terms of your assessment tasks. So yeah, excellent. Okay. I wanted to, as in all of our weeks, we're going to do a bit of a breakdown of the assessment tasks. I want to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable and confident about that, because we've gone through a lot this evening, a lot of foundational information around early childhood education and care, and I hope it's given some background and a perspective to base your understandings on, so especially for those of you who are new to the area or to the field in Australia. So last week I shared these points on the slide to introduce the assessment task, and hopefully now that you've digested these and you've also had the opportunity to have a good look at both the assessment task sheets as I recommended, and also the criteria sheet. As I said last week, this is what I mark from. Are there any questions that any of you have? Questions or anything that you need clarified at this point? Chat rooms available there. If you did want to type something in, I'll give you a bit of time to do that. No questions? Well, that makes me feel good. I've had lots of emails from you. We've got students at various stages. Some are still thinking about what they're doing. Others are well and truly on the way. They've got their research question established and they're starting to do their research. Kamiko, you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
I certainly can, loud and clear.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Angela. I was reading the assessment task sheet, and there was mention about that we need to refer to the week 2 reading when we're writing our critique in a formal academic writing style. So that's just a specific question about the writing style for this assessment.
Sorry, what was that? Oh, wait, on style. Write your critique in a formal academic writing style. Refer to the writing style of the weekly readings for the unit.
Yes.
The readings
yes.
set in week 2.
Yes.
I'm not sure what that means. I'd ignore that bit. I think.
Yeah, well, that was in a task sheet.
Oh, yeah.
And I was looking at one of the reading is an article, and another reading is actually journal. So I think you're probably you probably meant that we look at the journal.
I see what you mean. No, it's for examples of how to write academically. Thanks, Jade. Yeah. So
okay.
I guess if you're looking at journal articles specifically, so when you're reading your journal articles, for you to look at, like, it's very much a formula academic writing. You know, the use of words and standards and phrases. It's very much a formula, and I've given you an actual suggestion of the layout. So you've got,
I saw that. That's very helpful. Yes,
yeah,
thank
so
you.
It's just a suggestion. You don't have to go by that. But I think in the past, students have spent far too much time on their literature review. So the literature review is introducing the literature that you're going to discuss throughout your paper. So this is where you would mention everything that you're going to discuss and break it down a little bit Some of the important studies, you might mention the methodology used in the research, but not with all of them. But I would like to see that you do that in some of them. So, yeah, so 400 words for the literature review. So this assessment task needs to be concise. So, you know, this is a postgrad level, so your writing skills need to be good. You really need to be able to write in a concise manner. And it needs to be the way you write. You need to have really good, strong paragraphs leading into each other. You know, you really need to focus on that. APA 7, thank you. Yes, Warren, I'm just looking at this. APA 7 is the one that you need. I think I've even in the assessment folder down the bottom with the assessment support that I've given you. I think I've actually put a document in there with the changes from APA 6 to 7 as well. Okay.
Angela?
Yes?
Yeah, I have the questions about the assessment 1 because does these issues have to be in the Australian context? Because in the documents, I saw that the relevant early childhood curriculum document for this task is all about Australia.
Okay.
But I don't have no ideas about the Australia's context about the problem. So can I just use the compare to the Australian documents from the Chinese some documents about the early child to compare this?
Very good question, Annie. So
explore these issues.
Yeah, so we've got some of our internal students, international students. We've got students from China, from Vietnam, from Saudi Arabia. And some of them are here to learn about the kind of practices that we use in Australia in terms of early childhood. So, you know, using our particular frameworks. So they're comparing some of the curriculum documents in their country that they currently use with the documents that we're using. And so they're basing it around how children are supported using play-based learning pedagogies. So, and comparing from their country and to Australia, that's what they're doing with the curriculum documents. And so then moving into the second assessment task, they would then be working out, okay, what do I need to do to implement this? And do I need to do further professional development? Do I need to work with my colleagues when I get back home in my educational setting or in my future educational setting for those of you that aren't working at the moment? So yeah, definitely you will need to unpack the Australian curriculum documents, but I'm really encouraging you to compare and contrast as well. I always find it fascinating. I love reading these assessment tasks. They're very enlightening. Excellent question.
Okay, thank you.
So I've got some questions here. Can I send you an email with my research questions? Everyone's been sending me emails, so that's great. Priyanka, please do that. Sarah, you have @Angela. What does that mean?
Sorry, I was just reminding, yeah, you have popped that document up to compare the APA 6 and 7.
Oh,
what you were saying.
okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Excellent. All right. So Eunice is saying that her focus is on family involvement. Examine barriers that hinder family participation in curriculum decision-making in kindergarten. Excellent. That sounds great. Could you email me, Eunice, and we can have a chat via email about that? When you say learning journal, is it something on the Blackboard website? Okay, so a learning journal, I think I mentioned this last week. It's basically when you're reading through all of your, no worries, Eunice, you're reading through all of your journal articles, when you're looking at any clips, any provocations, or we have these discussions in class, I want you to have a learning journal. It's just for you. So it could be a document that you have on your laptop, a Word document, or it could be a diary that you actually physically write in, but it's to write down specific insights. This is really important, especially the first 2 or 3 weeks when you're trying to work out exactly what your focus wants to be, what you want your focus to be. So yeah, a learning journal. It's not something that you need to submit, Kumiko. It's just your own journal. So for you to write notes in. Does that explain? Excellent. Okay, so any further questions about the assessment task? Okay, so did any of the readings that you looked at this week inspire you in terms of ideas for your topic, for your critical essay? Was there anything in particular that you found helpful or helped you to direct you, or even possibly if it was something that you found inspiring or you disagreed with?
Well, I've come across the a fine balance. So that's understanding the roles of educators, which yeah, my yellow highlighter had a good run at it. Yeah, so it's just that difference between the intentional teaching and actual free play, as we call it. But then I have my own issues of defining play and what that is. But yeah, you're allowing teachers to, or educators, as he uses the term, to find that balance between intentional and spontaneous learning. So I just found the article quite interesting as well.
Which one was that, Warren? Can you?
So it's called A Fine Balance. It's by Leggett and Ford.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was interesting. It kind of links to also Rethinking Relationships by who is this? By Hatch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a link there as well, an overlapping link.
Very much about agency and giving children a voice.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
But then, of course, then Hatch goes on to question the traditional theorists and whether we should be applying as much as we do. And so, yeah, so it was all quite interesting to read.
Excellent. Yeah. And did you find that helpful in terms of, because what was your topic, Warren?
I'm looking at professional development. Yeah, in a way it is, because if we're going to question our traditional theorists, then we need an alternate viable model to put into place, or viable system or process, or whatever, or however you want to term it. So yeah, there is supporting literature. I mean, I've read through a whole bunch of stuff as well, which is not in our reading list for week 2, but yeah, they all seem to link, and they all mention areas of professional development and collaboration. But again, as I said earlier today, there's a lot of assumptions on what happens with that, and no one's mentioned the financial pressure or outcomes. So
yeah,
that's what
I think a lot of the time as well, it's about we talk about teacher as learner.
Yes.
A lifelong learner, and I guess we need to go beyond thinking of it as professional development in going and attending workshops and doing this. A lot of it, I think, is what you're doing now, Warren, actually investigating, reading, doing further study.
Yes.
To, not necessarily to find out what you've got to do, but to actually make you critically reflect on what you're reading, to come to some better understanding, some deeper understanding.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, like as you said, there's the teacher becomes they're supposed to be this lifelong learner, but then you're again assuming their motivation to do that. Some teachers just take on an early childhood as a job.
Yeah.
And that's understandable as well. That's fine. But then again, this is all your assumptions. And then it goes on to also the article by is it Arvanitis?
Yes.
Virginia Arvanitis, yes. About the teacher education and transformative and reflex learning and things of that nature as well. Yeah, so it talks about time and motivation and all of that. So all of these are linking, as I said, they all kind of support professional development and those type of areas. But there's only half of what I want to try and investigate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as I said last week, the biggest part is conceptualizing it and working out, I guess doing a lot of reading and working out what you want to use as well. Because
for sure.
400 words. 400 words to really, nut out what is important to you. Thanks, Warren. Thank you.
And I've mowed down a small forest for the 400 words.
Okay, Jade, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. So I read the Lifting Our Game report on the review of achieving early child educational excellence through early childhood interventions.
Yes.
So that just basically said all the benefits of early childhood interventions, and they didn't really go specifically. I read part 3, but I didn't read it all because it's a massive report.
Yeah.
So it kind of inspired me to think about like what are the best early childhood interventions for diverse children, and I'm trying to narrow my topic down to how does like early intervention in prep or kindy, I haven't decided, impact future school achievement, or maybe for one specific group of students. I'm not sure. Yeah. I don't know if I need to go narrower or.
I think, Jade, maybe if you email me what you've got so far and where you're thinking, and I'll see if we can narrow it down a little bit, because that's the hardest part. I think, what did we talk about? Butterflies everywhere last time. And it was, just trying to narrow it down. But if you send me what you've got, where you're thinking, we'll have a chat about it.
Yeah, but the reading was really, like, the report was really inspiring because it was saying all these benefits of like less grade repetition and less need for special education placements. I don't know if they still do that. It might have been done a bit a few years ago because but that's good.
Okay, excellent. Very good. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. So we've got from Fiona in Insider Perspectives on Developing Belonging, Being and Becoming. The quote is, "We recognise that in essence, curriculum is about what matters to politicians, policymakers, the media, academics, educators, communities, families and children, and about how what matters should be framed." So this links back to post-structuralism and who has the power when it comes to curriculum. Oh, nice, Fiona. Where are you? There you are. Did you want to talk a little bit more about that, Fiona? You don't have to. But yeah, it's as Kimiko says, and Fanny as well, that's a really, really good point. Curriculum, and it's not just the early years learning framework, but it's the Australian curriculum as well. It is created by these people in their offices. There's representatives from industry and education and politicians, but they all have an agenda. So yeah, but I guess when we narrow it down, you've got the curriculum up here, but it's how individual schools and then down to the individual early childhood teacher or primary teacher or secondary teacher, how they read the curriculum and how they want to implement it. And of course, they have power too. They make decisions about what they choose to use or not to use as well. So that's really interesting. And I think that's a really good something to question when you're looking at the early years learning framework or the Australian curriculum, not to just to question those the questions about who has the power when it comes to curriculum. Thank you, Fiona. That's excellent. Now we've got a few more points down here. Pamela read the article by Boyle Peretrowski, which about reframing transitions, which focuses on transition being understood as a process and proceeds to discuss transitions as events, processes, and continuity. Yeah, so you think it would be a really helpful article for your research. Excellent. Kimiko found the equity section on page 9 interesting in Insider Perspectives. So equity, if anyone is looking at that, page 9. Leisha, yes, the special needs students are in mainstream classes, with a document called IEP, which states the goals for each, the child each semester. Yeah, so there is the move away from the special ed classes now. Some schools still have a special ed class, but generally students with additional needs are in mainstream classes and they might go to other classes for one-on-one attention. Is that how you, Leisha, is that correct?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it is. It generally depends on the child and what they need. But say, for example, they may be pulled out of a language class.
Yeah.
And instead of doing language, learning French, for example, they're put over to help them with their reading or if they're dyslexic or have dysgraphia or something.
Yeah. So
they're put over for that one-on-one for that time.
Things have changed a lot, thank goodness.
Yes. And it's not compulsory for them to do a language.
Yes, yeah. So, Jag, yes, I was surprised they stated that there were special ed programs. This report was written down in Victoria where I think there are more special schools. My friend works as an educator at one down there and there seems to be a few about still in Victoria. We've got a couple of Victorian teachers here. Any comments or can you clarify that for us?
There are still special development schools for children, but it's not until they go to primary school that they would enter into those. In early childhood, they're still in mainstream services.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah. Excellent. All right, goodness, fantastic. Anyone else we've got Warren, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, what I found interesting, and when I can't remember who brought it up, they brought up the insider perspective of being, belonging, becoming.
Yeah.
Belonging, being, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There is on page 9 as well, but not under equity as much, but under distinctiveness. It says, to make ELF distinctively Australian, we intended to highlight the cultural and linguistic diversity that has been a feature of Australian society for at least 40,000 years. But then when you actually go into ELF, the document on page 6, it basically dismisses it by saying, recognizing this is a quote from that page, a specific document that provides educators with additional guidance on ensuring cultural security for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families will be developed and made available to educators. So I don't understand why they haven't really intentionally incorporated the Aboriginal history in ELF. They're just kind of going, oh, we'll put in a different document.
That's exactly true, and they have.
Yeah, I know they have. We've got the Reconciliation Action Plan, but why didn't they just build it into the ELF, as seems to have been implied in the Simpson article?
I think that's a really good point. If we think about the curriculum, well, with the Australian curriculum, they've done something similar with 8 Ways of Learning. We're familiar with that document.
Yes.
So again, it's sort of a separate document that goes into more depth, I think. Possibly they didn't want to just it to be surface level or superficial. So yeah, it's I guess again, we need to think of this as a guide.
Excuse me.
But
Yes.
I see where you're coming from, Warren. Yeah, completely. But I guess for me personally, I think that is something that the early years learning framework is lacking in. Like there are so many pedagogical strategies and practices and understandings that we can take from, for example, if we're looking at 8 Ways of Learning, how we can use that in an early years environment, like in terms of respecting and valuing Indigenous perspectives and ways of knowing and learning as well, that it could be incorporated in some way in the early years learning framework. And there has been some criticism about that. You may want to look at that further, Warren, if you are interested in that. Okay.
It'll be it'll be part of professional development, I believe, because
Definitely.
a lot of teachers just ignore it and move on.
Yeah, most definitely. Okay, or they put it in the differentiating for individual learners
That's true. Yes.
box in their learning plan.
Yes.
Yep, Jade says maybe they didn't put it in there because it was created and implemented in such a short time span compared to the New Zealand early years framework. Yes, Very good. Actually, that is another, if you wanted to have a look at another curriculum document, you might want to have a look at the New Zealand Early Years Framework. That might be something, if you are interested in the Indigenous perspective, to see what they've looked at.
But yeah, I think that's also very reflective of what Australia and New Zealand, there's a difference. Yes, they've actually named their curriculum, as Tiffany just put there, Tawariki.
Yeah.
They've actually used their native language.
Yeah.
Australia haven't, which again, it's strange.
It is lacking. I think if you have a look at the student example that we've got for this assessment task, that might be interesting for you to get a perspective on that. Okay. All right, where are we at? I just wanted to, this was what I put up for this week, just for those of you who are struggling to turn their focus into a research question. Does anyone want to share their specific research question? Has anyone got to that point yet? Can type it in if you want to, or you can share it verbally. So remembering that central to the task is pedagogy and curriculum. So you all have your interests and your focuses, but you need to be able to relate it to the curriculum documents, excuse me, in some way. And also making sure that it is an area that you can find enough research around as well. So Sarah says that hers is still a work in progress, but what role does age-appropriate pedagogy play in the first formal years of school? Oh, I like it. That's good. So cutting straight to the curriculum document. So looking at age-appropriate pedagogy specifically. Yeah, that would work. I like it. Again, you need to check and see the research around age-appropriate pedagogies, but I guess you could also be doing a comparison and looking at the early years learning framework as well, possibly what early childhood teachers could take, first year of primary teachers could take from that. But good, very good. Fiona's relates to STEM in a child-initiated kindergarten program. Excellent. Another really good area which you'll find a lot of research around. So you're going to have to work out what you want to use. So really condense it. I'd be focusing on recent. So when I say recent, I would be saying, especially in STEM, which is well researched in the last 5 years, Fiona, but recent is more in the last 10 years. I wouldn't be going beyond that in specific areas unless, of course, it is seminal. So by seminal, I mean research that is specific to that area, like really important research. I don't want to miss anyone. We're going through it. Warren, we're not tired of your voice, Warren. So Warren's looking at the quality of professional development and whether a financial value can be placed on the outcomes of quality PD in terms of child learning. Nice. Yep, still need to think through and work out the question. So trying to make it a little bit more specific, I think, yeah. Pamela's decided to use one of the example research questions, which is fabulous. What factors influence a smooth transition between prior to school and school context? Nicely worded, Pamela. Well done. Excellent. So Fiona, I am trying to limit it to 5 years. Good. 5 years is even better. That's excellent in terms of recent research. Especially, like, as I say, there are some areas you'll find more research than others, and you may have to branch out a little bit further, but start with about 5 years, I think, is a good place to go. Jessica's thinking about what factors influence a smooth transition between prior to school and school context. It's a great one. It really is a good one because, you really will be able to discuss some of those things that are really important to you, and especially those of you that are practicing teachers. Okay, so I guess if we've finished sharing, I want to move on to a final point, and this is about support services for success with your assessment tasks. So not just in this unit, but across all units. So I have already suggested to some students, especially if you've been out of study for quite some time, or you may need some assistance if English is a second language. You'll find lots and lots of resources that I provided for you in the assessment folder on Blackboard. But the place to go is to the library, so to HiQ. So you need to have a look and see. There'll be lots of workshops and things available. I was talking to Tiffany earlier about even emailing and seeing if you could get a one-on-one if you wanted to brush up on database searching and using key terms, all that sort of stuff. I would suggest everyone does that, really, because you want to be able to do it in a way that cuts down on time. You don't want to be wasting time. So you need to be as good about, needs to be as easy as possible. Kamiko has just said that she's working on how can ECT support EALD learners in early years settings. Good one. Should I narrow it down to prep to year 3? I think early year settings is fine, because if you specifically say prep to year 3, then that's the focus that you'll need to be looking for research on. So I would just say early year settings. That's fine. No worries. Okay. Any questions? Naomi, she's thinking of looking at the benefits of play-based learning in early primary. So you would be looking at age-appropriate pedagogies. You may want to specifically mention age-appropriate pedagogies in that question, Naomi. Just a thought that might be helpful to narrow that down in terms of focusing on specific curriculum documents. Yeah. And, you know, interstate, Victoria, Western Australia, all over the place. Of course, you're going to be looking at the documents in your state as well, like early years learning framework would be key, the most important, but there will be documents, local documents that you will want to refer to as well. Okay, we have gone through a lot. Warren says a number of articles that I've read before define play in different contexts and individualism. I believe it's a term used too loosely with vague definition. I have to agree there. Play can mean so many things. A very good point. Okay, we might finish up, I think. We could keep going forever, but I'm starting to fade, and I know some of you are probably fading as well. So keep in close contact over the next week with me in terms with email, in terms of finalizing those research questions. But I really would like by next week, everyone to have that, you know, sorted. Definitely have it sorted and be starting to do lots of reading and making sure you have, you know, an understanding of where your literature review is going. Okay, I am going to turn off the recording. So those of you who are listening at home, thank you very much. And email me if you need any assistance.